So it's my first inside the Lords, my second week, as we had a couple of days last week. Where to start with what's happening politically? But Happy New Year to you all. I actually was quite enthusiastic to come back to the Lords after the Christmas break. I had a very nice, relaxing time. And then the day before, I got this email correspondence from the Lords saying, we're now going to clamp down on visits. You can only have 2 people at once. You should be daily testing. You should be registering your test results. It was almost as though there was a parallel universe going on, because I think that after Christmas people were more and more becoming confident that the new variant wasn't so much of a health challenge, and that actually we should be looking at the relaxation of restrictions. And this completely irrational response, I think, set the tone for what we've seen subsequently, which is that despite the fact that every piece of news that comes out about COVID at the moment is countered by living in a very restricted society still, nothing is as normal. And if you're wandering around central London, it does feel completely empty, like a ghost town. So we come back, and of course we've walked straight into Partygate. This doesn't directly affect the House of Lords particularly, apart from the fact that I keep seeing bundles of small groups of Tory Lords standing around looking like they're having nervous breakdowns, plotting, and obviously the opposition delighted with themselves. So I just want to make a quick comment on it. Like everyone else, I am furious that the very time when people were restricted in the first lockdown, that those people who were making the rules were breaking them. This has almost become a cliche, and I understand the fury because I feel it myself. But there's something that worries me about all of this, which is the people who are making most of this are, of course, the opposition parties, the Labour Party, the SDP, Lib Dems, completely self-righteously giving lectures. The problem that we've got with this, of course, is that they are not critical of the way that we dealt with that pandemic throughout. The fact that actually the restrictions that were imposed, which we are being reminded of every few minutes by people who say, on that date in May, my brother died, I wasn't able to hold his hand. The funerals where you couldn't hug the person whose son had just died, who was 5. All of these tragic stories should be where we pause and say, did we respond in the right way at the time to a virus which, after all, largely targeted the vulnerable by bringing in restrictions that closed the whole of society down and demobilised it and discombobulated us. But no, the very people who were calling for more and heavier restrictions, and at the moment are still saying that there should be increased mask mandates everywhere, are not calling for a lifting of the track and trace or isolation rules or anything else. If anything, are accusing the Tories of being too soft on COVID, even now in 2022, when it's so much of a less of a health threat. Those people are the ones who are making, in a way, opportunistic hay out of Boris Johnson's total inability to rule the country. Now, Boris Johnson has been shown up. But another thing to add, because this is important, my fellow peer, Lord Andrew Adonis, is very excited about Boris Johnson's potential demise and has said the end of Boris means the end of Brexit. I think everybody who voted Leave will recognise that Boris Johnson was not responsible for the Brexit vote. He doesn't take any credit for the Brexit vote. For a moment, he did lead the Tory party to save Brexit when it was about to be overturned by the likes of Andrew Adonis, but he certainly does not embody it. And this idea that Brexit is dependent on Boris, I think, is insulting to Leave voters. But it's also a moment to be wary, because we do know, as I know in the House of Lords, that the Remain alliance, the hardcore Remainers, have not accepted the democratic decisions of that vote in 2016 and will use anything and everything to undermine it. And so the resignation of David Frost, Lord Frost, which is, of course, a complete furore amongst Leavers, a real concern, because he actually was one person in the House of Lords who I really trusted. And the fallout from that, I think, does mean that we are in a precarious place. not because Boris takes any credit for Brexit, but because we know that there are Remainers on manoeuvres. So I don't even care whether Boris Johnson resigns. I mean, God, this is the least of our issues that we're facing. But I do think that the feeling that there's something rotten in the establishment is widespread, and I would just simply expand that to being far more than within the Tory party. I mean, if it were only the Conservative Party, and I felt that there was some alternative major political party, then you would look at it, but that's not the way I feel at all. Specifically on what's happening in the House of Lords, well, one of the things that I did last week was that there was an emergency motion on energy prices and the cost of living crisis, and there was hardly anyone in the debate. It was just a debate, it wasn't a piece of legislation, but it did really dawn on me that what passes for an emergency in Parliament is very different to what passes for an emergency in the real world. So whilst the political parties are still behaving as though COVID is the greatest threat, actually for ordinary people what passes for the real threat is really worrying. I mean, I'm scared about getting my gas bills, electricity bills. I think we all are, but also from the point of view of the impact it will have on small businesses, cafes, the whole industrial landscape is dependent on energy. And of course, because of net zero, which I do blame Boris Johnson and his government for, and all of the cheerleaders in all the opposition parties, we have got a genuine problem of a lack of energy. We have not got cheap sources of efficient energy at our fingertips, even though we have, because we could be fracking, we let nuclear decline. There's huge sources of gas and fossil fuels that we could be using that we have politically chosen not to use. So it was a reminder that parliamentarians live in a very different world than the rest of us, that was an ill-attended debate. And the only people that people kept talking about were the vulnerable poor, people who would be in fuel poverty. And I always talk about working class people and the majority of people as though they're kind of like, very, very poor. But it's actually, you don't have to be very, very poor. You just have to be living your life and not having enough money to pay for your electricity. I just think that there's a condescension there about always treating everyone as vulnerable and poor, to be looked after. It's not the same thing as actually fighting on behalf of ordinary people's interests. Okay, the other thing that I wanted to talk about was what's happened in relation to the police and crime bill. Two big debates. One was what looked to be a minor amendment, where some of us were arguing again that there should be special facilities for trans prisoners so that there was not the opportunity for trans women, physically male, to be held in women's prisons. And I thought it was a very honourable and modest proposal by Lord Blencathra and others, and I looked around the room and actually the chamber was quite full for that. And then I realised there'd been a mobilisation of the, let's put it, Stonewall friendly peers, and there was a big fight over that. But the thing I wanted to refer to was that I, in my speech, quoted Twitter. And I quoted it because I thought it was important to remind people that outside of here, because we've basically been treated like we were lunatics raising this as an issue. All these law lords kept standing up saying, I can't understand why you're making a fuss about this. What is there to make a fuss about? And, there's hardly any numbers. It's not something you should be, and it's ridiculous that you're creating this panic. And the people accused us of saying that all trans people were violent, which was not what anybody argued at all in terms of defending single-sex spaces in terms of women's prisons. But I was then completely treated with contempt for quoting Twitter, because apparently if you raise the issue of public opinion when you're talking about legislation, this is a very bad thing to do. Now, I'd just like to point out that as it happens, we've got a Conservative Party, every time I look, is bringing in a law because it says that the public wants it, right? Who actually rather opportunistically uses what they call public opinion to say, oh, well, it's all right, we have to ban demonstrations because everybody wants us to. We have to bring in Harper's Law, which is where they've mandated life sentences for manslaughter of service people, police, ambulance and so on. We have to, because there was a big campaign for Harper's Law, so we've got to bring it in, because that's what, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a real muddle about the relationship between Parliament and the public. 1 minute the public are a convenient stage army, when you actually say, because I was quoting Twitter to say there's a lot of public concern about this policy, you're treated like a populist lunatic who doesn't take making legislation seriously. On seriously making laws, next Monday is the last day of the police and crime bill, and it's when all of the amendments concerning the bans on protests will be discussed. We're likely to be in the chamber till 2 a.m. It's going to be very fiery, it's going to be very argumentative, it's going to be quite a battle. And as I've always said, I try and say that if the Conservative Party are acting on their manifesto, even though I didn't vote for them or their manifesto, from a democratic point of view, I try not to simply argue against them for the sake of it, because that's not my role. I think the Lords doing that is undermining democracy. When, however, they introduce legislation that actually was not in their manifesto, which is I think is dangerous or anti-democratic, I say that as well. So on these bans on protests, I have tried to argue throughout that, of course, it's important that people are not irritated the life out of and have their lives disrupted by the likes of Extinction Rebellion, but that's not the same as most of the rules that are being introduced, which will affect everybody and anybody who wants to be a dissident in the UK, and that's very dangerous. Right, so we're all planning this, right? And yesterday I wanted to raise concerns about an amendment put forward by the Labour Party, which was effectively to introduce public space protection orders around schools, fast track protection orders as well, around schools where apparently there's a major problem of demonstrators and protesters leafleting about vaccines, and also protests at vaccine centres. And you might think, well, I don't like those people who storm in to vaccine centres, neither do I. And if they storm in, they're obviously in breach of the peace, they should be arrested, as far as I'm concerned. And I don't certainly support the sentiments of some of the more extreme, cranky anti-vaxxers, although it is also true that those people who are not wanting to take vaccines are in all parts of society. And we've seen a big NHS campaign now of a lot of NHS workers who don't want to take the vaccine, or might not want to take the booster, or might not want to take the second vaccine, or any number of things, who will lose their jobs. And they're campaigning, they're actually getting some airplay in the media. Fair enough. So you can't just say anti-vax as a collective anyway. But yes, I know exactly who they mean when they're talking about the likes of Piers Corbyn et al., right? That crowd, of which I have no sympathy whatsoever. And it doesn't matter whether I've got sympathy with them, right? I still support their right to protest. If they're breaking the law as it's presently constituted, then yes, they should be dealt with. If they're just leafleting or sharing their obnoxious views, then you argue back, you don't ban them. So the Labour Party bring forward this amendment to ban those particular demonstrations. And I pointed out the dangers of public space protection orders, which are incredibly illiberal, used by council leaders to ban all sorts of activities, everything from walking your dog on without being on a lead to leafleting in general, any number of things. And I argued against it, and I said, you're giving a gift to the Conservative Party, the government, who are about to ban protests on Monday, and we're all going to be opposing them, and you're saying, anyway, the Lib Dems supported them. They got that amendment passed. And guess what? The government minister at the end said, well, although we don't accept your amendment for public space protection orders, you have raised a lot of important issues, which I can assure you we will be dealing with when we bring in the bans on protests on Monday. So talk about politically shooting yourself in the foot. Of course, they're delighted. I mean, they are delighted with themselves. One positive bit, though, was that Lord Coker, who is the Labour Party Lord who put forward this amendment, actually said in his opening speech that he changed the amendment having listened to Lady Fox, that's me, when I'd objected to it at committee stage, and he had actually taken on board some of my criticisms and changed the amendment. And actually, to his credit, he also defended my right to raise argument and debate. So I don't want to completely dismiss him, and we even had a chat about it. But the fact that tactically the Labour Party and the Lib Dems have effectively brought in an amendment that's been voted for now as part of the bill that will limit and ban certain people protesting. Has weakened their argument for Monday, so they've got not a clue what a free society means, in my opinion. So alliances in the House of Lords are, to say the least, fragile. My final thought is that Lord Paddock, Brian Paddock, Lib Dem frontbench spokesperson, argued in defence of trans women being housed in women's jails, in prisons, and he has, I see today, been complaining that he's had a pile-on from gender-critical feminists and supporters who have basically been calling him misogynist. And I wanted to tweet back, because he said this on Twitter, I wanted to tweet back and say, welcome to my world, but in a different way, because I have pile-ons every week over something. But on the other hand, I did actually think about it and thought that although I quoted Twitter, although I think that people should be free to pile on Twitter, I'm not trying to ban anyone, that actually it is the case that pile-ons on Twitter are unpleasant, right? And that it might be the case that rather than shouting at him, that if I could say to any of you who are watching, a considered letter with the evidence and so on might be the way to go, because he'll use that as an excuse, and I'll bet you we'll hear a lot more of him saying things like, this is why we need the online safety bill, because I've been bullied on Twitter. And you know, I by the way, I don't think he's a misogynist. I think that there were people in that debate who argued explicitly anti-women positions. He wasn't one of them. He was just opportunist. That's it for this week. Big week next week. Don't know whether, I don't think Boris will have resigned, but can we just stop making it all about Boris Johnson and have a broader political discussion about how we're going to go back to the old normal and freedom?